This evening we are beginning a series of discussions on practical psychology with the hope that we can bring some rather simple problems into more direct focus and in this way help each person to understand a little better some of the subjective processes going on within himself. We're starting this evening with a study of the defense mechanism or defense reaction. And this has to be considered under two general headings. First, the normal defense reaction. And second, the abnormal defense reaction. It is perfectly normal for a person in difficulty to try to extricate himself in any way that he can. It is also quite normal for each of us to defend things which we regard to be important. And it's necessary to develop a series of mechanisms or contrivances to make such defense possible. Thus, life, in most instances, is largely a matter of defense. The individual is attempting to protect himself and his values all the way through the years. And in the smaller, everyday occurrences, he is largely attempting to protect his own ego, to protect the decisions which he has made, the attitudes which he holds, the peculiarities which are natural to his nature. These become rather cherished factors in his personality, and he seeks to protect them, even as he seeks to protect his life, his honor, and his worldly goods. Thus, the defense mechanism or defense process arises early in life. It continues with us through the years, and if it is within the normalcy range, we carry it on to the end of life without any very serious inconvenience and without more than the usual number of psychic shocks. Even so, in its most normal forms, the defense mechanism is worthy of some thought. It nearly always exists for one reason only, that in some manner the individual is inadequate. Now, this is a large term, and we don't want to appear autocratic in our use of it, or to belittle the fact that nearly every person must be inadequate in something. There's nothing criminal or wrong about not knowing everything or being able to meet every emergency. Nor is there any reason why we should not occasionally admit that we are in the presence of an obstacle greater than we can meet, or in the presence of a situation that is distinctly too big for us. The normal person is the first to admit these basic facts. If the situation that he is moving into is simply beyond him, and he knows this, then he will raise certain types of defenses against the immediate or approximate danger. A good example of this might be an individual who has allowed himself gradually to drift into debt. He finally awakes one day and finds that he is no longer master of this situation. It is closing in around him and upon him. At the moment, there is really no way in which he can rise victoriously over his adversary. The debt is larger than he can pay. Therefore, there is no use fooling himself about this. And there's very little good to be found in any emotional outburst over the situation. His defense processes must now come into action, and he must find ways, if possible, to avert the coming catastrophe. Perhaps he is able to rearrange his indebtedness so as to give himself additional time in which to extricate his financial situation. Perhaps he is able to go to certain of his creditors and on a very simple and direct basis convince them that if they will give him adequate time, he can meet his responsibilities. if he forthrightly goes after his problem, then he is actually creating a powerful defense program against an emergency. The fact that he attempts to do anything at all is due to the fact that he is defending himself or something that he has, perhaps the loss of most of his possessions. Such defense is within the normalcy range, and there is no particular reason to assume that there's anything wrong with the individual who uses every possible, practical, reasonable, honorable means to extricate himself from a difficulty. Another type of our defense mechanism arises in the small child, but may also drift into the adult years of life. Small child breaks a family rule. It knows that it stands in immediate possibility of punishment. This becomes a rather much of an emergency for a small child. The child probably does realize that it cannot undo what it has done. Therefore, that even a good honorable repentance will not probably prevent parental displeasure. So the child has a number of possible alternatives. One of these is to fess up immediately, face the music, take the punishment, and say, I deserved it. Now, this is very factual, and this kind of thinking is not only pretty much to ask for a child, but is more than we can usually expect from an adult. Therefore, we are not able to be certain that this will happen. Although if the child has been properly informed and instructed on problems of personal conduct, it may be strong enough and equipped to do this. The second thing that comes to the child's mind, of course, is to put off the bad news, always on the ground that time may heal the wounds. The child may be a little unavailable about the time its misdeeds are first noticed. It may be out somewhere else in the neighborhood. Anything to escape the immediate impact of that first cataclysmic discovery of its fault. Another thing the child may do, and which also adults may do, and that is to begin to spin a yarn, create some kind of a story inclined to perhaps raise this small circumstance almost to a transcendental level. I remember at a revival that I attended inopportunely a number of years ago, there was a series of open confessions. They were a little competitive, but I guess the majority of them were well-intentioned. One individual who had gotten into a difficulty explained it by simply saying that they were going along all right, behaving themselves, being nice people, and minding their own business, when the devil came up behind and pushed them. Well, now this thinking is also sometimes used by small children in a little different way. They are not quite as well informed on the possibilities of the devil as an escape mechanism as the adult is, but they will blame it on circumstances. They didn't really tip over the bottle at all. It was the family cat that did it. And I've even heard them go into long discourses about how some invisible playmate was responsible for the catastrophe. Anything more or less to find a good story and stick with it. That is considered to be the next step. And sometimes these little people in their early life will stick to this story through spanking and punishment, weeping and moaning and insisting that they are misunderstood and that what the little white lie was really true all the time. This is another way of attempting to hope that you are going to get out of a difficult situation. Another action, a reaction that is quite common to a small child under these conditions, is simply to break into tears, to become a little bit hysterical. And as the parent's scolding rises, the child becomes ever more miserable and thus works a little scheme which is also rather practical later in life if you develop a good technique for it. Another thing a child will sometimes do in a condition of this nature is simply lay a deep planned strategy. They will have some nice, pleasant, wonderful, kindly deed already in the foreground for the parents when they get home. So that the first thing the child does is begin to win the approbation of the parent on some other ground or for some other reason they suddenly become very thoughtful, very obedient, very noble little creatures. And then the parent begins to look around for the broken bottle because they know that it's there somewhere. The attitude, it would have to be there because the child is obviously concealing something. This also happens quite frequently with adults. And you know the story of the man who brought the bouquet of flowers home to his wife on an unexpected occasion. She took the flowers, looked at him for a moment, and said, "Well, what did you do that was wrong?" We have this idea that if people get suddenly very nice, they are concealing something. And this is a problem with small children. But all these are different phases of defense mechanisms. They are simple ways in which the individual tries to escape from some kind of consequence that doesn't seem to be very attractive. Now, we get into the same thing sometimes in a pleasant evening parlor discussion of some theme or matter. Someone who seems to be a bit of an authority and is pretty proud of the little that he does know comes into head-on conflict with a real authority on the same subject. This is most embarrassing and can cause several bad moments. As soon as the neo-authority discovers that he is bested, he has several possible courses of action. One is to admit it, sit down, and improve his mind. This is a difficult one, however, because it has a tendency to cause him to lose face. But sometimes it is better to lose face than it is to lose what is above the face, and the individual must have a choice of some nature. Another possible situation is that realizing that he is bested and there's not much he can do about it, he can try to change the subject. This is also a very reliable mechanism if we are careful with it, or he may go so far as to attempt to break up the conversation and get all the folks to come over and have a sandwich. Anything to get himself out of the situation of realizing that he can no longer maintain his own position, that he is up against something that is beyond his control at that moment. So nearly all your defense mechanisms rise from the individual being at a disadvantage and being in this position, feeling that he must do something about it. Of course, this takes a lot of effort and endeavor and thoughtfulness and sometimes conspiracy if the person is not willing to simply admit that he is in the presence of a situation to which he must adjust graciously and without any unnecessary strain or tension. These kinds of defenses go into practically every department of life, and we find that under counseling, many persons strive to find various types of defenses against hurts, against prejudices, against gossip, slander, ridicule, intolerance, and all such pressures. If these pressures come from the outside, from other people, or from uncontrollable factors, then the person's only solution is to try to take care of it in his own nature. One of the ways that he immediately begins to try to take care of it is to withdraw into himself. If he finds situations around him are not endurable, then he has a tendency to create a new world within his own psychic life. This new world is, generally speaking, a world of interests or activities, and again within the normalcy range, represents a perfectly natural and reasonable compensation for a difficult situation. To escape boredom, he takes on new interests. To escape monotony, he creates variation or variety. To escape certain bigotries, he may move out of a social group. He must have some way out by means of which he can rescue at least a part of his life from the situation that is difficult for him. In close family relationships, the way out is often difficult. Individuals continue to live together over long periods of years without coming to any basic understanding. When this occurs, we have a great tendency for one or both persons to become more and more introspective, to seek inside of themselves for securities or for values which are denied them in their mutual association. This kind of retiral is also normal up to a point. And if it is held within the control of the reason or the consciousness, it may even, in many instances, prove beneficial. An individual with a good retiral pattern in which they can tremendously vitalize the inner areas of their own consciousness without morbidity or without exaggeration or without some abnormal situation arising in the visualization. Such persons as can attain a normal, if imaginary life, may in many instances protect themselves against serious nervous, mental, or emotional disturbances. Thus, a happy life lived inside of ourselves is not necessarily bad. It does, however, have this tendency to separate us more and more from reality. Now, the great difficulty is to distinguish between the types of reality. We are trying to separate ourselves from an unpleasant reality. Perhaps, however, in creating the mechanism, we gradually build a wall that protects us from all realities, thus gradually reducing our experience reaction and cutting us off from important lessons that we have to learn. There are some lessons that apparently can only be learned by means of a strong introspective life. There are certain lessons that we will never be able to learn until we realize that our own internal life is our strength. So this lesson can be important, but it is not important if it causes a general block in which our entire objective consciousness withdraws and leaves us out of contact with the daily realities upon which our experience must be built. Another type of defense mechanism that we find very often is the defense that is built around a basic sense of weakness. Now, there are people, many people, who have to create defense mechanisms at one time or another, because there is no one in the course of lifetime who will not meet or come in contact somewhere with something stronger than himself. But there is also a constitutional kind of psychic weakness in which the individual will go through life and find himself inadequate to almost every occasion. He is unable to actually face the normal problems of daily existence. He is all weakness. His weakness extends into almost every area, and therefore he is inadequate to almost any situation that arises. Now, this weakness may be of one of several kinds. It may be a weakness which simply arises from lack of interest in becoming strong. The person whose mental life is lazy may find that he is inadequate or unable to cope with the minds of those around him. If he has neglected the cultivation of his own nature, if he has failed to improve his character in what ways he could, but has simply drifted along upon a surface very largely composed of doing as he pleased, he may come to almost any emergency ill-prepared. This type of person is therefore almost always on the defensive. Nearly anything in life is too big for him, and he must gradually develop an almost perpetual defense pattern. One of the most common of this type of pattern, of course, is the old-fashioned bluffer. The bluffer is an individual who is trying desperately to convince other people that he has more ability than he really possesses. On another level, he may be the bully, who will keep on bullying until he meets the person who is really stronger than he is, and that's the end of that. Also, the negative kind of individual who attempts constantly to withdraw into a neurotic silence. There are two kinds of silence in this world. One is the silence of the very wise, who could say many things but choose not to, and the silence of the very foolish, who never had anything to say in the first place. Now, this twofold silence is not always easy to detect which one it is, but Many people regard silence as a great defense against making a mistake. It's like the old idea, you can't do many things wrong if you do nothing. But of course, doing nothing is itself the greatest wrong that you can perpetuate or perpetrate upon yourself and others. The individual can consequently retire into an almost complete inactivity, rejecting and refusing any situation which might be difficult to face. The weaker he is, the more he has to reject and refuse, until finally this becomes a chronic pattern in his temperament. If a person finding himself inadequate is willing to continue to condone this condition, he must, in the sense of a certain self-pride, try to conceal it. And no matter how well he attempts to conceal it, it will out in the due course of time. And whenever it does appear, it becomes a crisis. The inadequacy then suggests to anyone, it would seem, that the discovery that we are not sufficient to our ordinary needs should inspire us to do something about it. We should become more industrious, we should become better informed, more thoughtful, and attempt to develop those characteristics which we want other people to believe that we possess. This, however, is hard work, and is not a particularly popular form of therapy. In fact, nearly everyone would rather take a sedation and forget about it. But if this goes along and drifts through the years, we develop certain temperaments and personalities which are not particularly ingratiating and certainly never carry us to any marked degree of success. We become drifters, floating along from one negative situation to another until we finally come to the brink of the ultimate negation, which is the end of life itself. Thus, in almost every pattern that we live in, we are trying to protect ourselves against hurts, protect ourselves against loss, protect ourselves against being shown that we are wrong. And this is one of the biggest protection problems that we have. Many people have developed a constitutional defense mechanism. They have arranged to live in a kind of world that never existed. By this process alone, they make all the rules of this world non-valid. They live in a world in which, very largely, they are the creator. The universe is run by rules which they have decided upon. God is the kind of being that they have affirmed God to be. And living in a private world, they are therefore comparatively free from the common vicissitudes of life. Of course, they are also free from all the valuable experiences which life could bring them. And the living in a private universe is a nice defense mechanism, but one of the most dangerous and also ultimately one of the least profitable. All these different patterns work into our daily relationships with each other. And there are very few persons who are able to sort of relax and simply be themselves without fearing they have to apologize or defend. The simple answer, as the Zen monks used to know and still practice, is that in all these problems of defense there is no disgrace in not being able to do that which is unreasonable. Therefore, there is no reason why we should not keep the currents of life clear by simply admitting the natural facts of things as we know them and as we experience them. We may in some cases pass through temporary setbacks as a result of this kind of honesty, but in the long run we will gain in stature and certainly enjoy more peace of mind. Because never mind how we figure it, every lie takes two more to hold it up, and by the time we get through prevaricating a situation or misrepresenting it, we are in far more difficulty than we would be if we said in the beginning, yes, I'm the one that made the mistake, now tell me what I have to do about it and let's get the thing cleaned up. This is the simple, natural way which we all fear. We fear it because of this instinctive dislike to be wrong. It almost seems as though if anyone criticizes us, they're criticizing God in proper person. That whatever this divinity is within us is hypersensitive and is particularly unhappy when it is chided for something. Actually, this self-pride or this egoism has become involved in our economic thinking. We feel that if we allow ourselves to be proven wrong in many things, that we will not advance economically or socially as well as someone else would. We're a little afraid, to be honest, in these things. But there are several reasons why we should give it a good hard thought, because honesty and dishonesty are habit-forming, and we cannot afford to develop the habit of mental dishonesty. It gets us into too many complications as we go along. We therefore can recognize the magnitudes of problems and try to keep them as far as we can in the open. A defense mechanism that we can understand, that we know why we're doing it, we know how we're doing it, and we know what it is attempting to accomplish. If we can keep it out there where we can see all shapes and forms of it, we're at least somewhat protected against the neurotic tendency. But if this process of defense becomes automatic, if it becomes an immediate and inevitable reaction arising in ourselves at all occasions, then we're beginning to get in trouble. So I think we can say that the average person in his defenses should give a little more thought to the facts and not permit himself to become emotional over his problems and his efforts to justify either himself or his course of action. This habit of justifying will inevitably ultimately cause us to try to justify something that is not right. Try to prove ourselves right when we were really wrong. And then we go into a form of mental dishonesty which we can't afford to cultivate. So in most cases, your defense mechanism is merely the inner resources of the person rising to meet an emergency. And it should be no more and no less than this, that we use the best we know and the best we have and the best we are to get ourselves out of some difficult situation into which we have perhaps come unknowingly, or through the connivance of other persons, or through perhaps some reasonable lack of knowledge for which we could not actually be blamed. The main problem always, therefore, is to look the whole situation over. Now, there are a great many people who have been forced to build defense mechanisms simply because they have endured unreasonable situations too long. And when the person finds that he has to live by some form of artificial defense against a situation around him, then it is perhaps better for him to contemplate a very honest, head-on attack upon the situation itself. There are many persons who have ruined their lives trying to endure something, and at the end they have gained nothing. They were not appreciated, they were not thanked, they were not understood, and in many instances they were actually blamed for not having cleared up a situation much earlier. I've known a great many cases of this, and it causes us to pause and wonder whether this so-called patient person was really a patient person or actually a masochist. Many people feel a certain sense of virtue or value from suffering itself and allow themselves to become victims to self-pity mechanisms in their own natures. Such will never produce any real or practical good. Others lack the courage to head into facts. Others lack the honesty, because sometimes to clear up these facts may mean an economic loss. But if the facts are not cleared up, I wonder how much economic gain can compensate for 50 years of personal misery. There is a grave question about that, and yet I know people who have attempted it. I know people who should have broken up a situation long ago but because it would have injured them financially, they endured it. Now, after many, many years, these people are utterly miserable and useless, sick, mentally and emotionally unstable, and even though they have protected the economic situation, they cannot even enjoy spending a dollar. They've lost all sense of value as a result of the compromise of integrity long ago. This situation, then, would again be the subject of defense. You ask an individual why he has done this, and he may have 100 artificial defense explanations, some of which he hopes that he can believe himself. He very little really believes them, however. And under analysis or under real pressure, he will admit that the reason why he is in his predicament is not because of nobility of character to carry a burden, but because he did not wish to give up a plush living for an uncertain future. This type of thing is a mistake, so that even in our times, the damage that is done to the psychic integration by being forced to live a false front or a false way of life should give the person immediate cause to think through his own situation. If he is in an impossible situation, he must do something to actually solve or clarify it. Now, sometimes when he's in an impossible situation, it's because he is impossible. And this is also something that we can't afford to overlook. Many people blame others for characteristics that are essentially their own. One thing we know from many case histories that it isn't always necessary for two persons to change for a situation to improve. Sometimes it is, but very often a valuable experiment can be made by either person who decides to make certain alterations in his own characteristics. Sometimes we are in these difficult situations because our own temperaments make it hard for other people to be honest with us. They have fallen into the child defense mechanism. They also feel that they must retire, keep quiet, prevaricate, or invent in order to prevent a head-on collision with us. So if one person makes a reasonable adjustment, it will frequently correct the pattern to a degree that it can be solved with reasonable dignity. So wherever difficulties arise, it's not good to try to use some formularized solution to them. And it is not good to try to create mechanisms in which our own dignity is the first consideration. We can't make it work. There are times when we just can't be dignified and honest, and therefore it is far better to be honest. We have to sometimes face the simple fact that we've made a pretty bad mess out of something. This may in itself clear up the situation more rapidly than we realize. Now, all these together form certain general situations which we say come within the range of the normal person. There are things that we all do, tricks that we have all played at some time during life, and escapes that we have all looked for, even if we haven't succeeded always in finding them. But now we come into something that becomes a little more dangerous, and that is your defense mechanisms in connection with the abnormal, or the person in whom these mechanisms do not represent merely moods, but are warnings of deep-set tendencies or trends that can lead to mental disease. And here, of course, is where everyone wants to stop short and take a very careful look at himself and the way of life which he is living. Nature has shown us frequently and repeatedly that no way of life that is itself essentially unreasonable can result in good for the person who tries to live it. The life of the person must be a natural, simple, direct, honorable existence, or he will be in trouble. This kind of trouble can get pretty confusing as we go along. But now let us imagine that the small child that we were telling you about a little earlier, said that actually she didn't tip over the bottle. The family cat did it. She knows when she says this that she is lying. Now, this in itself means that she is a comparatively normal child. But I have known cases in which, having created the pattern, the child gradually came to believe that the cat had tipped over the bottle. And this is where it gets complicated. This is where suddenly the individual is no longer in control of their own lie. Something has happened. And this happens very many times in very many ways. The individual suddenly accepts his own defenses or escapes as real. They are no longer instruments which he can control and use as he sees fit. These instruments become the realities and turn on him. This is one way in which we produce a first-class neurotic. This is the case in which an individual who has used some form of escape device has used it so long and successfully that suddenly it turns and begins to use him. It is like a monster of Frankenstein. It turns on its own inventor. And this happens in a great many different ways. People who start out controlling the psychic exaggerations of their own minds end up as narcotic addicts end up, hopeless victims of their own bad habits. So there comes a time in which, instead of the individual defending himself, he defends his own defense of himself. He may say, when someone blames him for something, that he does not feel well, or that he's had a bad headache, or something of that nature, thus trying to excuse himself. If he keeps this up long enough, he will have the headache. The headache will develop within him. The escape mechanism will gradually take over the dominance of his psychic life. And the mechanism creation which he has fashioned becomes more and more his true self. Now, in the course of various defenses against pressures from the outside, we may not always be entirely consistent. I've noticed, and many psychologists are aware, that as the individual has several different mistakes which he can easily make in life, he has to have several different patterns of defense and escape to take care of these mistakes. Sometimes his defenses are not even consistent with each other. Sometimes he will plead one situation to get out of a certain pattern, then he will plead the opposite in order to get out of another pattern. Little by little, he may break up his personality into a series of sub-personalities, each one of which is lustily engaged in defending some phase of his own ego. One will defend his truth when he is prevaricating. Another one will defend his philanthropy when he is foreclosing a mortgage. And still another one will defend him as a perfect parent when he hasn't been home sober in 5 years. This type of situation, moving in, creates a whole group of defense entities or defense structures within one person. These, in turn, can develop semi-individual existences, creating what we might term phases of split personality. Under these, the individual moves from what he calls a mood to another mood. But actually, all of these moods are merely defenses against some experience or circumstance arising in life. The moment a problem appears over the horizon, the individual shifts into the mood with which he intends to face that problem. Now, if he does this of his own accord, he may just have a difficult disposition. But if he cannot prevent doing this, if it becomes an automatic process, and to his own amazement he finds himself doing one of these peculiar escape actions, then his entire psychological integration is threatened. Then the patterns are being set within the psychic nature itself, and he is beginning to operate involuntarily in obedience to these patterns which he has set up. Thus, a person with an hysteria pattern will gradually use hysteria for every evasion of life. At first, he is perfectly able to put on a spell of hysteria any time he feels like it. Ultimately, however, the hysteria pattern grips him, and he finds it's emerging through himself, compelling him, forcing him to obey it, rather than his being able to invoke it when he pleases or when he feels he wants to. So out of the defense patterns, we develop certain definite neurotic symptoms. And these neurotic symptoms gradually come to be identified with the person. And as we all of us sort of feel that whatever comes from the inside is ourselves, so surely our neurotic pressures become a natural, normal phase of our own personalities. But as they are not natural and as they are not normal, the moment we give in to these pressures, the moment they become dominant in our lives, we are on our way to trouble. We gradually create personalities which no one can live with. We create attitudes that no one wishes to share. And we damage our own popularity and efficiency, success and health. All these things occur when the individual becomes a true neurotic. And one of the causes of a neurosis is this tremendous urge to protect self against the common ills of the day. So, for one reason or another, we can get into a very complicated situation. Now, one of the cases that has been held against religion by a great many people is that religion offers so many very clever, interesting justifications for being wrong about something. In the first place, religions are of all breeds and kinds. You can get a religion that demands almost anything and rejects almost anything. Some religion will not let you go to the motion pictures. Another religion will not let you eat meat. Another religion will not permit you to see good in anybody else. All of these situations become much involved in the psychology of a neurotic person, because you can nearly always find a good quotation somewhere in the Scriptures for whatever mood you happen to have at the moment. And this is supposed to overwhelm all controversy on the subject. This is a final word of authority. So if you remember in the Bible, in one place it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly." This would justify one line of conduct. A few lines off, it says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly." This starts another line. So you can always quote the one you need. And most people quote the one that makes them appear to be right. Now, this is a splendid device if you're working with believers, but it's pretty hard to make it effective if you happen to be among a group of, shall we say, conscientious agnostics. They just do not see it that way. And the more you do that, the more conscientious they will be in their agnosticism, because they will lose much confidence in religion when they see it abused in this way. I knew an individual who had a perfectly foul temper, and one of the most unpleasant tempers I've ever known in a God-fearing individual. People used to say to him, "Well, you believe in God, you go to church regularly, what do you do about this nasty temper of yours?" He said, "I haven't got a bad temper." And of course he was ready to explode when he said it. But there are moments when you are entitled to righteous indignation. And he suffered in a perpetual state of righteous indignation. Indignation against everything. And yet he was perfectly convinced that he was a good, devout, honest, God-fearing citizen. But he had found one way to escape by reading all the cases in the Bible where the Lord lost his temper. And if God can do it, there seems to be no reason why he couldn't. He carefully avoided all quotations about agreeing with thine adversary quickly. He read the part that pleased him. Now, I know a great many persons also in various lines of religious thinking have used other phases of religion as a means of defending themselves in an emergency. I've even heard good theologians try to do it to physicists and biologists. I can't say they were very successful, but as far as they were concerned, they were well satisfied with the result. No one else was. But any way in which you can force your point to make it stick by some means that seems to be reasonable or logical. You may be considered even unreasonable, but if you're considered devout at the same time, that's a big help. That takes the edge off of it. It's always wonderful to suffer for your beliefs. And when you can't suffer for anything else, there's a chance of that. And lots of folks make the best possible use of this opportunity to be miserable. The whole situation always centers on this one situation, this one axis point, namely the person cannot accept the fact that he can be wrong. It's just something that hurts us all the way through to the bone. Occasionally we have to admit it, but even then we really feel that we're just being humble. We're really better than we even want other people to think we are. All of these situations lead to habit structures that are peculiar, to say the least. Now, let's imagine for a moment that you are one of those people that does have a quick temper. Perhaps you have a virtuous thought in the fact that you get over it quickly and you don't hold grudges. That's one nice, that helps, and it is good. But if you don't hold grudges, why not stop the temper before this? Why have to have this beautiful spirit of repentance set in? Why not prevent it and save energy for other purposes? Well, some people feel that a good repentance is something worth living for, and that one of the ways to repent is to do something that justifies it. And I know among the Slavonian people in southern Europe and so forth, southeastern Europe, there are religious sects that really almost recommend individuals sin regularly in order that he can have a good wholehearted repentance about once a month. Now, we would say this isn't exactly the best way to do things, but there are people who sincerely believe it. In fact, they've made creeds out of it. In fact, there are a great number of them who hold this attitude. But I think the real answer lies in not doing these things in the first place if we can possibly avoid them. So as you sit down and study your own life a little, think for just a moment occasionally about the instincts and impulses with which you react to sudden and unexpected pressure. If the doorbell rings and someone comes to see you whom you have not expected and is going to considerably discomfort or inconvenience you, how are you going to react to this? What is your natural reaction? I don't mean what are you going to say, because in all probabilities you will say, why, my dear Mrs. Smith, I am delighted. What I'm wondering is what you are thinking, whether or not you are wishing her into one of the remote sections of perdition at about that time. Or supposing in some conversation that comes up, someone makes a statement that you really disagree with. A statement which causes a slight boiling in your own nature. How are you going to handle this? Another time when there's a problem of two persons, yourself and someone else, trying to plan something. Are you going to press your plan to the end, or are you going to let the other person have a chance at the plan? That is another situation that comes along. To what degree are we willing to sacrifice our own pleasures or our own comforts for some other person for whom we are presumed to have regard? To what degree are we going to allow the small children to keep us home when we want to go out? And to what degree are we going to resent the fact that these small children do this? And so on down through hundreds of different ordinary episodes. What are the natural reactions that we have to what we call interference? Are we going to immediately begin to build escapes, defenses? Are we going to try to find some way of shifting these responsibilities? Are we going to deny them? Or are we going to bear them with grudging martyrdom? Or what are we going to do about them? If we're good, healthy people, and our psychic integration is normal, we're going to think these problems through very rapidly. Incidentally, how long does it take to think a problem through? It probably would be very difficult for us to estimate the time factor at all if we could move mentally by the most direct path or the direct course through the problem to its reasonable solution. With a normal, ordinary, reasonable equipment of mind of our own, nothing spectacular or fussy, just a reasonably good intellect, the average person can probably think a situation from its cause to its conclusion in something like a third of a minute. Why doesn't he do it? Because he spends 2 hours trying to think through the thing into some solution or pattern that he wants. It isn't the fact that is slowing him up. It's his effort to escape the fact, change the shape of the fact, emotionalize himself in or out of the fact, rationalize his own defenses against the fact, and say to himself in a nice, long, heart-to-heart talk how miserable the fact is making him and how he dislikes somebody who has tossed it at him. By the time he gets through with this, the decision takes anywhere from a half a day to 2 weeks. For perhaps the whole subject will be dead before the decision is made. But the simple thinking through of the fact to its proper conclusion, what is the truth of this matter? What is the reality in it? What is the thing that should be done? Not what I want to do, but what is the thing that should be done? If the person could move into this pattern rather quickly and quietly, and with very little resistance to the pattern, if facts are more important to him than anything else, there is very little likelihood that he'll ever be a neurotic. He will be able to handle the fact. If the fact says he shouldn't go out, he'll stay home. If the fact says that he should go out, he will go. If the facts that as he finds them means that some whim of his own will damage or injure or hurt another person, he will instinctively not indulge himself. He will weigh his values as to what is the better, the wiser thing to do, always realizing that maturity must lead, and that if his mind is quicker, his decision is better, his sense of values are more real than those of another person, then in this he becomes responsible for that other person as well as himself. In other words, if he knows better, then he becomes responsible for this decision, because he is the one who is capable of arriving at it in a reasonable manner. So in all these difficult situations that come along, there are very simple answers. And the polygraph shows this very clearly. That's the lie detector. The lie detector indicates very definitely that when man's thinking approaches questions, his answers are scriptural. Well, the good book says, let thine answer be yea, yea, or nay, nay. And that is exactly the way it is. The individual's reaction under test conditions is instantaneous and complete. There is no batting around the bush. Always the indirect, inconclusive answer is evasion. And that is how the lie detector determines the criminal as the evader, as the person who will not face the facts squarely, but will begin to try to defend himself against the possibility of revealing his own guilt. So in all these things that become pressures in our lives, there are right ways of handling these pressures and wrong ways. If we can develop the habit of handling them the right way, we won't have much more trouble with them. Most persons are perfectly aware of what is the right way in the majority of the problems that face them. Where a few problems become extremely complicated and are obviously beyond our judgment, then any judgment is dangerous. Then the problem is that we must seek help or counsel or advice or be given time to consider and analyze. Consequently, where the problem in our own hearts, we know we cannot cope with it, then we have a right to delay the answer and to make the necessary investigations of the facts, rather than to believe such things as might be detrimental to the truth. A good example, for instance, of a certain tendency to emotional mental dishonesty in ourselves is our attitude toward people. Humanity as a whole is a bad news thinker about people. Gossip will travel much further than truth. There's an old saying, you know, that truth crawls along the ground and gossip has wings, and there is a certain amount of that is real. Also, bad news travels faster than good news. For some reason, the dramatic, which is often the violent, receives the greatest publicity, the greatest recognition, and the greatest attention. Therefore, in our own natures, we must be ever watchful for this. It is much easier for us to build dislikes and sustain them and increase them than it is to sustain likes. Also, there is a natural chemical tendency in people to choose or to not choose other people. These natural psychological tendencies are observable throughout life, and there is simply no use in denying them. There are known cases, for instance, in hospitals where a patient with a certain nurse will never recover. The nurse is perfectly sincere, perfectly efficient, but there's a personality clash that will never do any good. A different nurse and the patient begins to improve immediately. There are persons in life that are simply unable to establish close psychic affinities, either in family or in friendship. This does not mean that we have to dislike these people, but it does mean that they are not going to be successful as intimate friends of us or of the individual with whom they do not have this psychic affinity. However, the absence of psychic affinity often leads to an entirely more difficult and dangerous situation. Having a certain psychic resistance against these people, we are most certain to agree with any bad report we hear of these people. We know that anything that is said against them must be true. Anything that is said for them is probably untrue. And pretty soon we begin to build up strong likes and dislikes which are based actually only upon psychic pressure in ourselves. Now, the pressure may be natural, but to build this pressure into attitudes means that we have to be a little unfair somewhere along the line. The proof of this is the opposite situation, in which we have lovingly defended, protected, supported, and suffered for absolute rascals simply because we did have a certain psychic affinity for them. So just as surely as we can like the wrong people, so we can dislike people without any real justification. This justification as we have it may be purely psychological. I know people who have instinctively disliked persons simply because they resembled other individuals with whom this person had had difficulty at some time. A tone of voice, a mannerism.